Plot structure is one of those things that is difficult for beginner writers to understand, and yet it is one of the most important things that you need in a book. Everyone needs structure. Even people who discovery write and figure out the story as they go, if they want to have a novel that has a good chance of actually selling, they are going to have to go back into it and make sure retroactively that it is following the right structure. Now, thankfully, a lot of authors like Stephen King, who are discovery writers, have an innate sense of what structure is, and so as they're going along, they're sort of following structure as they go. But if you don't have some kind of structure, then you don't actually have a story. You just have things that happen. And there are actually quite a few story structures out there, but honestly, most of them are kind of saying the same thing. Some people will even say that there are no hard and fast rules around storytelling. I disagree. And that every possible structure out there is so different and it is really just a tool to be used if you need that kind of story structure, depending on your specific situation, which to a degree is true, but I think this attitude actually does a little bit of a disservice for newer authors. Established authors have a lot of things that they are familiar with, a lot of different tools and tricks of the trade, but they took a while to acquire all of that knowledge and they have a much better sense of whether they should use it or not. When someone is just starting out, they don't know a lot of the things that established authors know. And it is very difficult for those established authors to then sort of turn around and impart their knowledge to these people because there are so many different ways you could take it. And this attitude that there are many ways to go, many different templates that you can use, and that they're all tools to use at your disposal. While that is true, I think it does a disservice because it implies that writers can just write whatever they want for their story, and that's okay. That's actually not true. Because despite what everybody says, there are stories that are better than other stories. And there are authors that, if you look at the course of their career, they and everyone else would admit that what they have later in their career is better than what they had earlier in their career. What that implies is that there are skills at work here, something that they weren't so good at the beginning and then later, after lots of experience, became good at. And if there are skills, then those skills can be taught, they can be broken down and made easier for newer writers to understand. And that is exactly what this 40 chapter outline that I have developed is doing, and I call it the 40 chapter plot module. Now, this plot module has been in the works for a while and I'm finally excited and ready to reveal it to the world. This is the story structure that I wish I had 12 books ago when I was getting started. It gives you a 40 chapter outline and tells you exactly what should be happening in each chapter. Now, of course, these are not hard and fast rules. You can deviate from this if you feel so inclined, but for newer authors, this is a great way to really understand and learn story structure. And for a lot of established authors too, I'll bet you will find that this saves you a lot of time in figuring out where your story should go next. Now, I could go on and on about how I developed this thing, but you are probably interested in what's actually on it and what it looks like. Well, it is divided into 4 parts, and each part has 10 chapters each. We start with Act 1, which, like all of the other acts, makes up 25% of the story. It does a couple of things, including introduces us to the protagonist and the ordinary world that they live in, as well as their goals, their flaws, and the inciting incident that forces them to leave the ordinary world. Then we move into Act 2, specifically Act 2A, which is the first half of Act 2, which also makes up 25% of the story. It is the first half of the middle section, which shows us positive rising action as the protagonist enters the new world, learns, grows, and has more successes than failures. This is basically the kind of stuff that you would see in a movie trailer as the protagonist is learning, growing, training, all of that sort of thing. Then we move into Act 2B, which also makes up 25% of the story and is the second half of the middle section. And Act 2B, even though it's still part of the second act, is really kind of an act on its own because it is a reversal of Act 2A, resulting in negative rising action as the protagonist struggles against the antagonist and things slowly start to fall apart and get even more desperate. And finally, the fourth part is Act 3, which makes up 25% of the story, like all of the others. It is the climax of the story where the protagonist finally confronts their inner flaw and overcomes it, and which allows them to defeat the antagonist despite very, very tall odds. So let's just do a brief overview of what all of these chapters look like. First, we actually have an optional chapter. So while there are 40 chapters here, there are actually 42 because there are 2 additional and optional chapters. One is a prologue, which gives us an opening image that sort of visually represents the central conflict of the story, particularly if it does not directly involve the protagonist. Then we move into the protagonist's life with a really bad day where they sort of we get used to the world that they're in, but we also get a sense of what they really want in life and that they're not getting it in some way. We then move on to chapter 2, which is a mystery and a theme. One of the things I discovered in all my research is that almost all of the gripping stories out there, even if they're not mysteries, have some sort of mysterious element at the beginning. It's one of those things that can really get people reading. And then the mystery and the theme is something you want to keep in mind, because at some point the theme needs to be stated, right? So if you have a character whose flaw is that they don't take themselves too seriously, maybe they're a little hard on themselves, then the theme would be someone coming in and saying, you're too hard on yourself. You need to learn to let go. And that will be basically the statement that sets up everything that's going to happen throughout the rest of the novel. In chapter 3, we have a link to the antagonist. This is a moment where the protagonist finds that there's something connecting them to the antagonist or the forces of the antagonist that they can't ignore. They're more than just a random citizen in the story that we're in. They have some kind of unique connection to the antagonist that makes them important. The ultimate cliche version of this is they are the chosen one, right? Where the antagonist has to take note of them. But think of it as the chosen one trope, kind of on a lesser scale, something that's really tying them to the antagonist. We then get a grasping at straws chapter where the character is kind of like resisting this push, the things that it's learning, and this push towards a new world that they don't really like. But they discover as they're resisting that stasis equals death. This is a phrase I got from Save the Cat, where they discover that if they remain in their ordinary world, they're going to end up dying, whether that is physical death or it could be emotional, mental, social, or financial death. And this usually leads right into the inciting incident. This is the big thing that sort of pushes them right out of their comfort zone and disrupts everything that's going on in the ordinary world that they live in. This is often accompanied at the same time or shortly thereafter by a call to adventure, a moment where the protagonist decides, they need to do something, and yet there's still a lot of resistance there. This call to adventure is often accompanied by a mentor, someone who comes along and sort of helps the protagonist in the state that they are in. But there's usually a refusal of the call, a refusal of what the mentor brings the protagonist, where the protagonist really kind of digging their heels in, not wanting to take this leap. We then get a pull out the rug chapter where, whether the protagonist wants it or not, something happens that causes them to really just have to take steps. And they move out of their ordinary world into this much broader, much stranger, newer world. Which leads us into Act 2, and the first chapter of Act 2 is called The First Plot Point, where the protagonist actively chooses to enter into the new world, and there's going to be a little bit of floundering as they sort of enter this really unfamiliar realm. Then we get our Enemies and Allies chapter, where we are introduced to pretty much the remainder of the cast that we haven't met at this point, particularly any important sidekicks or love interests that might have a role to play in the story. There's often some conflict there between them and the protagonist themselves. And that also leads into chapter 13, which is the B story. The B story is basically where a character, such as the love interest, but it can be the mentor or any other character, kind of comes in and helps the protagonist work on their flaw. This is a moment where the theme might be stated again, and we're really like learning sort of the message, what is the story about from chapters like this one. We then get a set of 3 different chapters that in Save the Cat are called Fun and Games. I split them into 3 specific chapters to give us 3 attempts at, basically it's like a montage, a training montage, where in the first one the character is trying something new and they might fail, they might not, but even if they do fail, it is a fall forward where they're gaining new skills, they're learning new things, even if they do ultimately fail the test that they go under. In chapter 15, it's very much the same thing, but they make a second attempt or they try something else and they might fail that trial as well. In chapter 16, they might actually have some success, something that actually helps them earn a little respect among all of the other allies' characters and maybe get a little bit of attention from the antagonist and other enemy characters. And because of that attention, we are led into chapter 17, which is called the first pinch point. This can be a literal or non-literal battle between the protagonist and other antagonistic forces. This is an ideal place for a plot twist or something big that happens that kind of upsets the status quo that has been building this whole time. We then get chapter 18, which is problem revealed, where the protagonist it's kind of a reactionary chapter where the protagonist sees everything that happens and realize they're a little over their head. And in chapter 19, that chapter sort of continues where they learn critical information that kind of messes things up a little bit. It changes their whole worldview. And that leads to the midpoint where the main character might actually have a success. It's going to at least seem like a success. And they are also forced to sort of look at themselves in a figurative mirror and realize that there is something within them that needs to change, although they're not quite ready to make that change yet. This is a major turning point of the story and an opportunity for the external conflict, the A story, and the internal conflict, the B story, to kind of intersect. And that major turning point leads us into Act 2B. And the first chapter, External Demons Close In. This is where the literal villains of the story, whoever that might be, are starting to get more and more threatening. And in chapter 22, it gets even worse. In chapter 23, this is another sort of reactionary chapter to everything that's been going on. The internal demons, or the internal doubts or fears or whatever the protagonist has going on inside them, will start to really manifest and get to become a major problem. And so at this point, the main character and all of his allies are not doing so hot. And so they formulate a plan of attack where they sort of regroup, figure out what they're going to do, and make a plan. Now, the protagonist can't just be a random member of this group. They have to have a crucial role, which is what we establish in chapter 25. Once that crucial role has been established and the plan is put into motion, we get to the second pitch point, which is another battle against the antagonist. But once again, the protagonist realized that they severely overestimated the antagonist and they are way over their head, and things kind of fall apart, which leads us to chapter 27, where all is lost. This is a major low point of the story where things just don't seem like they can get any worse. It is often accompanied by a shocking revelation, something that came with the All Is Lost chapter, where it just seems like there just isn't any hope anymore. The protagonist may feel guilt, they may feel anger, they may alienate some of the allies that they have with them. And this leads to a moment of depression where the main character it basically gives up and says that they can't do it, that they are not the one for this job, that they just can't keep going on. But one or more of the allies might come in and give them a pep talk. This is just a motivational speech where they sort of help the main character dig deep within themselves and realize that yes, they can do it and that they can't give up now. And that leads us into Act 3, the final climax and the last 25% of the novel, where in chapter 31 we have the Seizing the Sword chapter. This is basically where the protagonist figuratively or literally picks up a sword. They pick up the tools that they need, or even just the mantle of responsibility that they need to go at the antagonist and their forces. And from there, they gather the team in chapter 32, which is basically, it's very similar to the plan of attack that we saw earlier, but this time he's going around and maybe making amends with some of the allies that they might have offended before, starting to really gather that team and get ready for another major confrontation, which leads us to a set of 3 different chapters here with the first, second, and third stage of the final battle. The first stage is basically where the protagonist and his allies put the first part of the plan into place, and it actually usually goes very smoothly. The second stage of the battle also usually goes well and succeeds, but at this point, some of the allies might be dropping off. Think of Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, where Harry Potter, by the time he gets to the final challenge at the end, Ron and Hermione have left. They ended up not being able to continue, which leads us to the third stage, where the protagonist is basically all alone up against the antagonist and thinks that he's got this or she's got this, and then finds out that she does not have it. And they have another All Is Lost moment where the antagonist gets upper hand on the protagonist and things just don't look very good. And that leads us to the ultimate defeat, where it looks like the protagonist is just not going to be able to make it, that all is lost, that things are not going to work out in the long run. And the protagonist has a moment that I just call a use the force Luke moment, where the protagonist has to dig deep inside themselves to really find that nugget of a thing that they need in order to win. Usually it is a confrontation of an internal struggle they've been having this whole time, and they finally make a personal change or a change in attitude and beliefs that allows them to actually succeed. From that comes the unexpected victory, where they actually are able to overcome the antagonist and win. And this is basically the final climax of the story, where everything, just explodes, or, whatever happens. The man and the woman kiss for the first time, or they get engaged, or whatever it is. This is the final moment of that climax where everything comes together. Then we have a few chapters that are sort of, in the three-act structure, it's called the denouement, or the falling action. And we start with the bittersweet reflection, where, we have the protagonist has won the battle and they have changed as a person, but there's almost a certain sorrow with seeing the life that they left behind in order to make the changes that they had to make. And we see very vividly the death of self that this person has had, how they are a very changed person. And there's a closing image at the end of this chapter where we get to see just how much this person is different from the person that they were in the very first chapter that we see them. And then we have one last optional chapter that I call the after credit scene, as a nod to Marvel and their after credit scenes, where it's basically just a teaser of the conflicts to come, the conflicts that might still remain. It's useful if you're doing a series, and particularly in certain genres. Now, some of this in the wording and everything that I've been using might seem a lot like it is only for action thrillers or fantasy sci-fi, but really you can adapt these things however you need to do it, for romance, for mystery, whatever it is that you need. Just figure out what is the antagonist or the protagonist of say a romance, right? An antagonist could be the parents of the love interest who don't really want the two to get together. It might be societal norms, right? An antagonist could be a whole lot of different things. So we're not necessarily talking about life and death situations here. This could be as simple as a relationship that may or may not work out, and that the sort of death, the all is lost moment that we're encountering is just those moments where we just don't think this relationship is going to work out. That's an example for a romance story, and I could go far in more depth of how this applies to every genre, but it will work for every single genre. All right, so note that this is a plot template that I have put together specifically for a simple standard novel with a single major protagonist. Now, if you happen to have more than one viewpoint character, that is a little different. You would have to add additional scenes for that specific viewpoint character, and if they have a character arc, which they ideally should, you're going to have to put a separate progression of scenes to show that character arc for that character. And this is why I named this the plot module, because something I'm going to be developing in the future is more ways to create other scenes for other characters and a way of layering them in a way that makes sense for the story. You'll see, for instance, in epic fantasy, it's one of the only genres that allows for multiple viewpoint characters that go really in depth. And so you can get 400,000 word novels. And the reason they're able to do that is because they have a lot of viewpoint characters, each one of which probably has a similar story structure to what you see here. As it stands, if you have 1,500 to 2,000 words per chapter here, you're looking at a 60,000 to 80,000 word novel, which is about standard for most simple novels. But if you're going to add another viewpoint, that might expand it to 100 or 120,000 words. So I'm going to be developing a lot of different modules that you can then work with this 40 chapter outline as a way of putting them together, and in such a way that they sort of fit perfectly into the overall structure. But that said, you can absolutely take this 40 chapter outline for a simple single protagonist story and use it all over the place. And I've already outlined about 6 books using this outline template that I'm going to be handing off to other writers and doing myself and doing with AI, and basically doing a variety of different things. I'll have more to say about that in the future. Now, if you want to get your hands on this document that you see right here, this document is available completely for free to those who subscribe to my email list. Those of you who are interested can find it below. And I am actually working on a completely original book on this subject, where I will basically go far more in depth than I'm able to do here in one video. And that book should hopefully be available here in the next couple of months. Now, if you want to learn more a little bit about story structure and other essential story storytelling skills, I have a video called Storytelling 101 that you definitely want to check out. I'll put a link to it here. But I hope this video was useful for you, and I'll see you in the next one.